Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into an idea that many of you have actually asked us to explore, prioritarianism.
Mm,
Now, at its core, prioritarianism is about how we should rank different outcomes morally. What makes one situation better or worse than another from an ethical standpoint. Think of it as a framework for making tough choices when different people are affected in different ways.
exactly. And what makes prioritarianism particularly interesting, I think, is its central focus. When we're comparing potential futures, we give extra moral weight to improvements in well-being for those who are, well, currently worse off.
Right.
It's a really fundamental question about fairness, isn't it? Does a benefit to someone struggling matter more than the exact same benefit to someone already doing well?
Yeah.
That's where prioritarianism offers a distinct perspective, especially when you compare it to something like, say, utilitarianism.
Right. Utilitarianism, as you might know, generally aims for the greatest total happiness,
Mm-hmm.
right? Often adding up everyone's well-being almost without regard to how it's spread out. Prioritarianism says, wait a minute, a step up for someone at the bottom of the ladder is morally more significant than the same step up for someone already near the top.
Yeah.
It really challenges us to think about whose well-being should take precedence.
And just to be clear for our dive today, we're focusing mainly on axiological prioritarianism,
Okay.
which is really about how we rank overall outcomes as morally better or worse. We're not primarily talking about what makes an individual action right or wrong or, defining an absolute level of goodness.
Gotcha.
We're focused on the relative moral value of different possible situations.
So it's about comparing different potential realities from a moral perspective.
Hmm.
And while prioritarianism can definitely inform consequentialist ideas, the belief that the morality of an action depends on its results, it's not necessarily tied to that, is it?
No, that's a good point. You could theoretically have other ethical frameworks that incorporate the prioritarian intuition. Precisely. So for this exploration, let's maybe pin down a working definition. Prioritarianism ranks outcomes based on the total sum of individual well-being in that outcome, but with a crucial modification. Each person's well-being is first transformed using a specific kind of function.
Okay, a transformed well-being. Here's where it gets really interesting. What does this transformation actually look like?
Well, the transformation uses a function that has two key characteristics. It's strictly increasing and strictly concave.
Yep.
Strictly increasing simply means that more well-being always translates to a higher transformed value. No exceptions there.
Right, more is always better in that sense.
Exactly. Now, strictly concave is a bit more nuanced, but think of it like this. Imagine climbing a hill that gets less steep as you go higher. The effort you put in at the bottom gets you a big jump in altitude, right?
Yeah.
But the same effort higher up yields a much smaller gain. That downward bend, that curve, represents the idea that the increase in moral value from an improvement in well-being is greater when you start at a lower level.
Ah, I see. So that curve visually represents the diminishing moral impact of more well-being as someone becomes better off.
Mm-hmm.
A small improvement for someone really struggling creates a much larger leap on this transform scale than the same improvement for someone already thriving. It's kind of like those first few dollars when you're broke make a huge difference, right?
Yeah.
But a few more when you're comfortable, while nice, don't have the same life-altering impact.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And just to keep things focused as we begin, we're going to look mainly at scenarios where the same individuals exist in all the outcomes we're considering. These are called fixed population scenarios.
Okay, simpler to start with.
Yeah, it allows us to really grasp the core principles before we introduce the, added layer of complexity that comes with different people potentially existing in different futures.
All right, so we have this core idea. Prioritarianism ranks outcomes by this transformed sum of well-being, giving that extra moral weight to those who are worse off. Now, how does this actually compare to other ethical frameworks we might use to evaluate different situations?
Yeah, that's a fundamental question. Prioritarianism falls within a broader category of what philosophers call welfarist rankings.
Welfarists.
Yeah, these are approaches that agree on three key principles or axioms: Pareto indifference, strong Pareto, and anonymity.
Okay, let's quickly clarify these. Pareto indifference, what's that?
Pareto indifference simply states that if everyone is equally well off or maybe equally unaffected in two different potential outcomes, then those two outcomes should be considered equally good from a moral perspective.
Right. If nothing changes for anyone, there's no moral difference. Makes sense.
Exactly.
And strong Pareto.
Strong Pareto says that if everyone is at least as well off in one outcome compared to another, and at least one person is actually better off, then that first outcome is morally superior. It's the pretty straightforward idea that improvements in well-being, without making anyone else worse off, are generally a good thing.
Got it. More well-being for at least one person, no less for anyone else, means a morally better outcome. Simple enough. And finally, anonymity.
Anonymity means that when we're evaluating an outcome morally, what matters is the overall pattern of well-being. Who has what level of well-being, not the specific identities of the individuals holding those levels.
Ah,
So if you just swap the well-being scores between two people in a given outcome, the overall moral goodness of that outcome wouldn't change. It's about the distribution, not the names attached.
okay. So prioritarianism agrees with these basic building blocks of welfarist thinking. But as you pointed out, it's not the only welfarist approach. Utilitarianism is also welfarist.
Absolutely. Standard utilitarianism simply adds up the well-being levels of everyone in an outcome and ranks them based on that total.
Right.
The crucial difference with prioritarianism is that concave transformation function we discussed. Utilitarianism uses the raw well-being numbers directly.
Yeah.
And that's why it can sometimes lead to conclusions where, a large increase in well-being for the already well-off outweighs a smaller but perhaps more crucial increase for someone struggling significantly.
And our sources mention other welfarist rankings too, like generalized Giannini, Lexman, sufficientism, PLT. We don't need to get bogged down in all of those right now, but their existence shows that prioritarianism is just one particular way of moving beyond a purely utilitarian calculation. Yeah.
Exactly. These alternative frameworks try to capture different aspects of fairness and how we should value different distributions of well-being. Now, what's fascinating and what our source material really highlights is that there are three specific principles or axioms that help to uniquely define prioritarianism and set it apart from these other welfarist views: Pigou-Dalton, separability, and continuity.
Okay, these sound important. Let's break it down. Pigou-Dalton first. What's that about?
The Pigou-Dalton principle states that a pure transfer of well-being from a better-off person to a worse-off person, where the amount lost by the richer person exactly equals the amount gained by the poorer person, and nobody else has affected this transfer, is considered a moral improvement as long as it reduces the difference in their well-being levels.
So, like taking a slice of pie from someone with a whole pie and giving it to someone with only a crumb, even if the total amount of pie stays the same, the situation feels fair. Is that the idea?
That's a good analogy, yeah. It captures that intuition. It's like saying that reducing inequality by helping the worse off without hurting the total amount of well-being is a step in the right moral direction.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense, especially when we're thinking about prioritizing those who have less.
Precisely. And this is actually where standard utilitarianism falls short. Because if the total sum of well-being remains the same after this transfer, utilitarianism sees it as morally neutral, no better, no worse.
Oh, wait.
But remember that concave function in prioritarianism.
Yeah, the bendy curve.
That's precisely what allows prioritarianism to satisfy Pigou-Dalton. The increase in transformed well-being for the person who is worse off outweighs the decrease for the person who is better off because of that curve.
Okay, so Pigou-Dalton is a key distinguishing feature between prioritarianism and utilitarianism. What about separability? That sounds a bit more technical.
It is a bit, but the core idea is that the moral ranking of two potential outcomes should remain the same regardless of the well-being levels of individuals who are completely unaffected by the difference between those two outcomes.
Okay.
So imagine a decision that only affects Alice and Bob. Separability says our moral preference between the possible outcomes for Alice and Bob shouldn't change just because there are other people out there, like Carol and David, whose well-being remains exactly the same in both scenarios.
Still a bit abstract.
Yeah.
Can you give her a concrete example, maybe?
Sure. Let's say we have two scenarios just for Alice and Bob. Scenario A, Alice has well-being 5, Bob has 5. Scenario B, Alice has 10, Bob has 3. Now, let's say, based on our moral framework, maybe we decide A is better than B, perhaps because we're concerned about Bob's low level in B.
Right.
Separability says that if we now add Carol and David to the picture, and let's say Carol has 80 well-being in both scenario A and B, and David has 30 in both scenario A and B, our original ranking shouldn't change.
Uh,
So the outcome with Alice, Bob, Carol, and David in scenario A should still be better than the outcome with them in scenario A. Carol's and David's well-being, since it's constant across both options, shouldn't influence our choice between A and B for Alice and Bob.
okay. Okay, that makes it clear. The moral evaluation should really focus on those whose well-being is actually at stake in the choice.
Exactly. It keeps our moral focus where the differences actually lie.
And the last axiom, continuity.
Continuity is, yeah, a more technical condition. But essentially, it says that if we have one outcome that is morally better than another, then any outcome that is sufficiently close to the first one, meaning everyone's well-being levels are just slightly different, should also maintain that same better ranking relative to the second outcome.
So no sudden flips in moral judgment just because of tiny, tiny changes.
Pretty much. It's about avoiding drastic shifts in our moral judgments when there are only very small changes in people's well-being. It suggests a certain kind of stability or smoothness in our moral evaluations.
Okay, so no tiny little improvement in someone's situation should suddenly flip the moral superiority of two vastly different scenarios. It suggests a kind of consistency.
That's the general idea. Now, as our source material highlights, I think it's in Table 1, prioritarianism is actually quite unique in satisfying all three of these axioms: Pigou-Dalton, separability, and continuity.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Utilitarianism, as we said, fails Pigou-Dalton. Other theories like generalized Gini fail separability. And interestingly, approaches like Leximin, which gives absolute priority to the worst off and PLT, they fail continuity.
Wow. So prioritarianism really threads a specific needle there.
It does. It makes it a distinct and arguably coherent way of thinking about moral betterness based on these quite fundamental principles.
That's a really helpful breakdown. So prioritarianism isn't just some vague idea of helping the needy. It's a specific philosophical framework built on these core axioms that distinguishes it from other ethical viewpoints.
Mm.
Now, the term prioritarianism really gained prominence in philosophical discussions, largely due to the work of Derek Parfit. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. While, thinkers before him had certainly touched on similar ideas, it was really Derek Parfit's 1991 Lindley lecture that brought prioritarianism, or the priority view, as he initially called it, to the forefront of philosophical debate.
Right.
His clear articulation of the concept and his arguments for it definitely sparked a great deal of the subsequent analysis and discussion we see today.
And he introduced this concept using a really relatable, almost everyday kind of scenario involving the philosopher Thomas Nagel and a decision about his two children. But that always stuck with me.
Yes, that Nagel two-child case was very influential in illustrating the core intuition. Parfit described a situation where Nagel had to choose between, I think it was, living in the suburbs, which would provide a significant well-being benefit to his healthier child, or living in the city, which offered access to crucial medical treatment that would provide a smaller but perhaps more vital well-being benefit to his second child who had a serious health condition. And importantly, the numerical gain in well-being for the healthy child in the suburbs was actually larger than the gain for the sick child in the city.
Right. And a purely utilitarian approach, just focused on maximizing the total well-being gain, would seem to favor the suburbs in that scenario.
Yeah.
Add up the numbers, suburbs wins.
That's right. The sum of well-being in the suburban outcome was higher. However, Nagel intuitively felt that moving to the city to help his sicker child was the more just decision, describing it, I think, as an egalitarian decision. Parfit used this case to explore what Nagel meant by egalitarian, and then to propose his alternative, the priority view, what we now call prioritarianism. It really made philosophers pause and think about whether simply maximizing total well-being was always the right ethical goal.
And Parkett was very careful, wasn't he, to draw a distinction between egalitarianism and prioritarianism. Not just that they might lead to different outcomes sometimes, but that they have fundamentally different reasons or justifications for those outcomes, as our source puts it.
Yes, that's a crucial point to understand the nuance here. For Parfit, egalitarianism, at least in the forms he was primarily engaging with, sees equality itself as having intrinsic moral value. Inequality is seen as inherently bad. Prioritarianism, on the other hand, focuses on the moral importance of benefiting people because they are worse off. The reason is their low level, not the gap between them and others. Reducing inequality might be a consequence of this, often it is, but it's not the primary driving force. The moral weight of a benefit is inversely proportional to the recipient's initial level of well-being.
So an egalitarian might favor helping the sicker child in order to reduce the inequality in well-being between the siblings. whereas a prioritarian favors it because that same benefit simply carries more moral weight when it goes to someone at a lower level of well-being, regardless of the impact on overall equality.
Precisely, you've got it. Parfit then went on to analyze what he called pluralist egalitarianism, which tries to combine this principle of equality with the principle of utility. The idea that it's also good to make people better off. He looked at both strong versions that heavily prioritize equality and moderate versions that try to find more of a balance.
And even these more moderate forms of pluralist egalitarianism, according to Parfit's analysis, run into the leveling down objection.
Yeah.
That always struck me as a really powerful challenge to egalitarianism.
It is a very powerful critique, yeah. The leveling down objection essentially asks, if inequality is inherently bad, then surely reducing inequality must be, in some respect, a change for the better, no matter how it's achieved, right?
Hmm.
So imagine a situation where we could eliminate all inequality by making the better off people worse off, even if no one actually ends up better off than they were before. Just drag everyone down to the same low level.
Okay, sounds pretty bleak.
Right. A pure or strong egalitarian might have to say that this new perfectly equal outcome is better in at least one respect because equality has increased. The objection argues that this seems deeply counterintuitive. Intentionally making people worse off just for the sake of equality doesn't feel like moral progress at all. It seems to miss the point of why we care about well-being in the first place.
Yeah, that feels wrong. And Parfit argued that even moderate egalitarians, while perhaps not saying the level down outcome is overall better, still have to concede that it's better in one respect because the equality has been achieved. Prioritarianism, by focusing on the actual levels of well-being and the moral weight of benefits, aims to avoid this whole uncomfortable conclusion. It wouldn't see making someone worse off as morally desirable, even if it results in greater equality. Its focus is on improving well-being, especially for those who need it most, not on the abstract concept of equality itself.
Exactly. Parfit emphasized that prioritarianism is fundamentally concerned with the absolute levels of people's well-being, not the relative differences between them.
Connects back to separability.
Exactly. This directly ties back to the principle of separability we discussed earlier. The moral ranking shouldn't depend on the well-being of those who aren't affected by the choice. And his idea of the diminishing marginal moral importance of utility strongly suggests that strictly concave transformation function we talked about right at the beginning, which in turn supports both the Pigou-Dalton principle and the requirement of continuity. Parfit's work really laid the foundation for understanding prioritarianism as a distinct and ethically significant alternative to both utilitarianism and, importantly, egalitarianism.
So Parfit provided a really powerful introduction and framing for prioritarianism. Now, beyond his initial work, what are some of the key arguments that have been developed in favor of prioritarianism? Like, what reasons do philosophers give for why we should adopt this particular way of thinking about moral goodness and badness?
Well, many of the arguments for prioritarianism operate within that welfarist framework we outlined earlier. So accepting Pareto indifference, strong Pareto, and anonymity as starting points.
Okay.
Since the Pigou-Dalton principle is really the core of what distinguishes prioritarianism from utilitarianism and embodies that idea of giving priority to the worse off, many arguments focus specifically on justifying this principle. Rankings that satisfy Pigou-Dalton are sometimes called extended prioritarian. So these arguments try to answer the fundamental question: why should a benefit to someone worse off matter more?
Okay, so arguments for Pigou-Dalton are basically arguments for giving that extra moral weight to improvements in well-being for those who have less to begin with.
Precisely. And one interesting line of reasoning actually comes from within egalitarian thought itself, albeit a more nuanced, pluralistic form of egalitarianism.
Oh, how does that work?
Well, if we value both increasing overall well-being and reducing inequality, then a Pigou-Dalton transfer, remember, that's moving well-being from richer to poorer without changing the total it achieves, one of these goals, reduced inequality, without negatively impacting the other. Total well-being stays the same.
Good.
So even from an egalitarian perspective that also cares about overall well-being, there's a case to be made for why such transfers are morally better. It shows how different moral values can sometimes align on specific principles, even if the underlying justifications differ.
That's a fascinating point. So you can arrive at a principle that's central to prioritarianism through a justification that also appeals to egalitarian concerns, even though their fundamental motivations about what ultimately matters might be different.
Exactly. It highlights that moral philosophy often involves finding common ground and understanding how different values interact. Another key argument, which builds directly on Parfit's own work, focuses on the distinction between the actual size of a benefit and the moral weight or significance of that benefit.
Okay.
The intuitive idea is that the very same increase in well-being, say, or reduction in pain by a certain amount, might have a greater moral importance if it's experienced by someone who is already suffering greatly compared to someone who is experiencing only mild discomfort.
Right.
It suggests that our moral concern should be sensitive to people's baseline levels of well-being.
That really connects back to the Nagel two-child case, doesn't it? The benefit of medical treatment to the sicker child just feels like it carries more moral weight than the larger numerical benefit to the already healthy child.
Absolutely. And Matthew Adler's claims across outcomes framework offers another way to think about this. He suggests that when we compare different possible outcomes, each individual has a kind of moral claim in favor of the outcome where they are better off.
Mm-hmm.
In the context of a Pigou-Dalton transfer, the individual who is worse off has a claim to the improved outcome. And Adler argues that the moral strength of this claim is greater precisely because of their lower initial level of well-being. Their need, or their relative deprivation, gives their claim more force.
So it's about the moral force of someone's need or their lack of well-being, giving them a stronger claim to improvement, like they have more standing to demand that change.
That's a helpful way to understand it, yeah. Niels Holtug offers a related perspective, arguing that the moral value resides in the specific compound state of affairs, the combination of a particular increase in well-being happening to someone who is at a specific initial level of well-being. He contends that the lower the starting level of well-being, the greater the inherent moral value of that subsequent increase. It's not just about the size of the benefit in isolation, but about who receives it and from what starting point.
It's like saying the same rescue effort has a different moral significance depending on whether you're saving someone from, like, drowning versus just helping someone who stubbed their toe.
That's a great analogy, yeah. Perfect. Our source also touches on some more formal decision-theoretic justifications for Pigou-Dalton.
Okay.
For example, Laura Buchak's work on risk-weighted expected utility, if you apply that behind a veil of ignorance, can lead to social welfare functions that satisfy Pigou-Dalton. Similarly, some arguments explore retaining the framework of expected utility theory, but relaxing something called the Bernoulli axiom, which can also provide support for prioritarian principles.
Right. Those sound more technical, but it's interesting that there are formal arguments backing this up, too.
Yeah, these more technical arguments offer additional layers of justification from within the field of decision theory.
So there's a really diverse set of arguments supporting the idea of giving priority to the worse off, ranging from intuitive moral principles and fairness to these more formal frameworks. But prioritarianism, as we've defined it, isn't just about Pigou-Dalton. It also requires separability and continuity. What are the arguments specifically for those two principles?
Right. Good question. When we move beyond just extended prioritarianism, which just needs Pigou-Dalton to prioritarianism as a fully defined ranking that also adheres to separability and continuity, we need justifications for those extra axioms too.
Mm-hmm.
For separability, Derek Parfit himself provided a really compelling argument in his big book, Reasons and Persons. It's often referred to as the Egyptology argument.
Ah, yes, the thought experiment that makes us question whether the well-being of, like, ancient Egyptians should somehow influence our decisions about future generations today.
Exactly. The core intuition Parfit aimed to capture is that the moral evaluation of outcomes should really depend on the well-being of the individuals who are actually affected by the choices we make. It shouldn't be contingent on the well-being of completely separate, unaffected individuals, whether they're distant from us in time, like the ancient Egyptians, or distant in space, maybe on another planet.
It just feels irrelevant, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What happened millennia ago or what's happening on Alpha Centauri shouldn't logically change the moral calculus of a decision that directly impacts people here and now.
Precisely. If a moral ranking violates separability, it leads to this really counterintuitive dependence. For instance, if our preference between two outcomes for people alive today changed based on how well off people were in ancient Egypt, that would seem morally arbitrary, kind of bizarre. Our moral focus should be on the consequences for those involved.
Yeah, that makes sense. Matthew Adler also argues, I think, that his claims across outcomes framework lends support to separability, too.
Yes, he questions why the strength of an individual's moral claim to a better outcome should depend on the well-being levels of those who are entirely unaffected by that particular choice. There just doesn't seem to be a morally relevant connection there.
Okay. And then there's continuity. We mentioned it's a bit more technical, but what's the core argument for its importance within the prioritarian framework? Why not just stop at Picca-Dalton and separability?
Well, the arguments for continuity often work by highlighting the potentially problematic and, frankly, counterintuitive implications of moral ranking systems that fail to satisfy it.
Ah, so arguing against the alternatives.
Exactly. Particularly approaches like Leximin, which
Mm.
gives absolute lexical priority to the worst off person, and PLT, which is prioritarianism with a lexical threshold.
Okay.
While these alternative approaches do satisfy Piggy-Dalton and separability, their violation of continuity can lead to seemingly absurd outcomes. They can imply that even the slightest, tiniest improvement in well-being for the absolute worst-off individual should be given effectively infinite priority,
Whoa.
no matter how enormous the potential gains might be for a vast number of people who are only marginally better off than that single worst-off person.
So a minuscule benefit for one person at the very, very bottom could theoretically outweigh massive benefits for millions of people just slightly above them. That does sound, yeah, extreme
Mhm.
and maybe unreasonable.
It does seem that way to many. While dropping continuity doesn't necessarily always lead to such extreme absolutist views, the source material suggests that the alternative rankings that do abandon continuity often have some other counterintuitive consequences as well. This makes continuity, and therefore prioritarianism, which satisfies it, seem like a more attractive and stable option for many moral philosophers. It suggests our moral evaluations should be sensitive to the magnitude of well-being changes and the number of people affected, rather than being completely fixated on absolute priority for the very worst off at all costs.
Okay, so prioritarianism seems to have a strong foundation in these core moral principles and enjoys considerable support from various philosophical arguments. However, like any comprehensive ethical theory, it also faces a range of interesting and important challenges. Let's maybe delve into some of the key criticisms that have been raised against it, perhaps starting with those coming from a utilitarian perspective.
Definitely. That's a significant area of challenge. And interestingly, some utilitarian thinkers have even questioned whether prioritarianism is fundamentally distinct from utilitarianism in the first place.
Oh, really? How could that be? On the surface, they seem to have quite different implications, especially regarding, distribution and inequality.
Yeah, the argument goes something like this. If you take the prioritarian approach, applying that concave transformation to individual well-being levels and then summing these transformed values, you could theoretically just define a new measure of well-being, let's call it moral value units or something, that already incorporates this transformation. Then, the prioritarian calculation looks mathematically identical to a standard utilitarian calculation, just using this newly defined, transformed measure of well-being.
So it's basically just utilitarianism, but with a different way of defining and measuring what we mean by well-being in the first place. Like they've
Yeah.
just baked the priority into the definition of utility.
Well, that's the challenge. But the typical prioritarian response is crucial here. They argue that the original measure of well-being, the one that we're transforming, like happiness or preference satisfaction or whatever,
Right.
that measure should be independently plausible as a measure of how well someone's life is actually going. And it should allow for meaningful interpersonal comparisons of well-being levels and differences in well-being. The concave transformation that prioritarianism introduces is specifically intended to reflect our moral priorities, that diminishing moral importance of extra well-being, and not necessarily a different fundamental understanding of what constitutes individual well-being itself.
Oh, so it's a layer of moral weighting on top of a plausible measure of welfare.
Exactly. When we compare outcomes based on this independently plausible measure of well-being, prioritarianism and utilitarianism will indeed often lead to different moral rankings, especially in situations involving inequalities. The prioritarian transformation is a moral weighting, not a redefinition of welfare itself.
That distinction makes sense. The underlying idea of what constitutes a good life shouldn't necessarily change just because we have different ethical views about how to weigh those levels when making social choices.
Okay.
So what are some other key challenges that utilitarian thinkers have posed to prioritarianism?
A really significant utilitarian critique, often associated with the work of John Harsanyi, centers on decision-making under conditions of uncertainty and the principle of ex ante Pareto.
Okay, uncertainty,
Hmm.
that always makes things complicated.
It does. Utilitarians often argue that prioritarianism tends to violate ex ante Pareto, while standard utilitarianism consistently satisfies it. This raises really important questions about how we should make moral decisions when we don't know for sure how things will turn out.
Remind us briefly what the ex ante Pareto principle entails again.
Sure. Ex ante Pareto basically has two parts. Ex ante Pareto indifference says that if everyone is equally well off in expectation, like considering the probabilities of different outcomes between two possible courses of action or prospects, then those two prospects should be considered equally morally good.
Okay.
And ex ante strong Pareto says that if at least one person has a higher expected well-being in one prospect compared to another, and no one has a lower expected well-being, then that first prospect is morally better.
Right. Seems intuitive based on expected outcomes.
Yeah, these principles have a strong intuitive appeal based on respecting individuals' preferences over uncertain outcomes.
And the utilitarian argument is that their approach lines up nicely with these principles of expected well-being, whereas prioritarianism sometimes clashes with them.
Exactly. Our source material highlights that standard ways of applying prioritarianism when dealing with uncertainty, like factualism, which just focuses on the actual outcome, ignoring probabilities beforehand, ex post prioritarianism, EPP, and expected equally distributed equivalent prioritarianism, EDE, can indeed come into conflict with ex ante Pareto.
Hmm.
This creates a challenging dilemma for prioritarians. Do they need to revise their theory to be consistent with ex ante Pareto? Or do they need to argue that ex ante Pareto itself isn't, an absolute, inviolable moral principle?
That's a tough spot.
It forces a deeper consideration of how our moral commitments to well-being and actual outcomes should relate to our evaluations of uncertain prospects.
So how have prioritarians responded to this significant challenge from the utilitarian side?
Well, there are different responses. Some prioritarians who lean towards factualism might question the fundamental importance of ex ante Pareto altogether. They might argue that ultimately what truly matters from a moral standpoint is the well-being that is actually realized in the end, not merely what was expected beforehand.
So focus on the results, not the bets.
Kind of, yeah. Others point out that while utilitarianism might satisfy ex ante Pareto, it often fails to satisfy the Pigou-Dalton principle at the level of actual outcomes.
The trade-off.
Right, meaning it can be indifferent to significant inequalities in realized well-being, which many find morally problematic. Furthermore, as we touched on earlier, the move to potentially drop the Bernoulli premise in expected utility theory can also weaken the force of the ex ante Pareto argument against prioritarianism. It shows that the debate often involves weighing different moral principles against each other and considering the trade-offs.
And the thought experiment involving the veil of ignorance, famously used to argue for utilitarianism, that also features in the debate between utilitarians and prioritarians, doesn't it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. John Harsanyi famously argued that if we imagine ourselves behind a veil of ignorance, where we have to choose principles for society without knowing our own position in it.
Right. Don't know if you'll be rich or poor, healthy or sick.
Exactly. And if we assume that individuals are rational, expected utility maximizers who adhere to the Bernoulli premise, then, Harsanyi argued, we would naturally choose principles that maximize average expected utility, which leads straight to utilitarianism.
Because in that state of uncertainty, you'd want to maximize your average chances of having a good life, right? Not knowing where you'd land.
That's the core of his argument, yeah. Now, prioritarian responses to this include perspectives like Laura Buchak's, who argues that behind the veil of ignorance, individuals might rationally choose to use risk-weighted expected utility, which can lead to outcomes that are more egalitarian, or at least sensitive to downside risks, though maybe not strictly prioritarian as we've defined it. Another line of response, still within an expected utility framework, but rejecting the Bernoulli premise, shows that if the function used to evaluate individual prospects is sufficiently concave, it can actually lead directly to prioritarianism.
Interesting. So relaxing one assumption flips the result.
Potentially, yeah. And perhaps the most direct counterargument is simply to question whether the veil of ignorance thought experiment provides the only or even the most compelling basis for justifying principles of social welfare in the first place.
Right. Maybe it's not the whole story.
Prioritarians often argue that our moral intuitions about the importance of helping the worse off have a more direct and independent basis, separate from these hypothetical choice scenarios.
Okay, so prioritarians have developed various counterarguments and alternative justifications to address these fundamental challenges raised from a utilitarian perspective. Now, What about thinkers coming from an egalitarian standpoint? They also have criticisms of prioritarianism, right?
Yeah.
Even though they both care about the worse off.
Absolutely. While there is definitely some shared ground, particularly in outcomes, egalitarians often critique prioritarianism precisely for not valuing equality as an end in itself. Larry Temkin, in particular, has offered several influential critiques that really highlight this difference.
And one of Temkin's key criticisms revolves around the idea of comparative fairness and a rejection of the separability principle, using that memorable example of the space travelers and the asteroid rich in vital minerals.
Yes, exactly. Temkin argues that our moral evaluation of whether we should, say, provide aid to the inhabitants of a distant planet shouldn't depend only on their absolute level of well-being, but also on how well off they are relative to others in the universe.
Hmm.
So if they are already significantly better off than the vast majority of other sentient beings, we might feel less of a moral obligation to help them, or perhaps feel that it's less morally valuable to do so compared to a situation where they are drastically worse off than everyone else.
Right, like you guys are already doing great compared to the galactic average.
Kind of. This emphasis on relative well-being directly clashes with prioritarianism's commitment to the separability principle. Remember, separability says the ranking shouldn't depend on the well-being of unaffected folks elsewhere.
Right.
Temkin's argument suggests that our moral intuitions are often maybe inherently sensitive to these broader patterns of inequality, these comparisons.
And as I recall, the typical prioritarian response to Temkin's argument is basically to stick to their guns on separability. Right? To maintain the focus on the absolute well-being levels of those who are being helped.
Mm-hmm.
From a prioritarian perspective, the fact that others in the universe might be richer or poorer is, well, a separate moral issue. Their primary concern is with the moral weight of the benefit to these specific individuals in need, considered in light of their own level of well-being, regardless of the broader cosmic distribution.
Exactly. They double down on the non-relational aspect. Temkin also challenges the leveling down objection, which, as we said, prioritarians sometimes use against certain forms of egalitarianism. He argues that the intuitive force of that objection might rely on a particular kind of person-affecting account of moral value.
That is, the philosophical idea that an outcome can only be considered morally better or worse if it is somehow better or worse for some particular person. Like someone has to benefit or lose out.
In a narrow interpretation, yes. If we strictly adhere to the view that only what affects individuals directly matters morally, then the leveling down scenario, making the better off worse off without making anyone else better off, isn't technically worse for anyone in a direct sense compared to the alternative of not existing or staying the same, depending how you frame it. You could even argue maybe that the previously better off might feel some moral satisfaction knowing equality has been achieved, though Temkin himself doesn't push that psychological angle hard. However, Temkin himself actually rejects this very narrow person-affecting principle, pointing to philosophical puzzles like the non-identity problem, those tricky cases where our choices determine who comes into existence in the first place.
Like the classic example of the woman who could conceive a child now, who would have a life with significant health problems but still worth living, or wait a few months and conceive a different healthy child.
Oh.
A strict, narrow person-affecting view struggles to explain why choosing to have the child with health problems seems morally wrong, because that specific child isn't made worse off by being born with those conditions compared to the alternative of never existing at all.
Precisely. That's the puzzle. So prioritarian responses to Temkin's challenge about leveling down often involve arguing that the objection retains its intuitive force even without relying on a strict, narrow person-affecting view.
Right.
They might say there's something inherently morally undesirable about intentionally making some people worse off without providing any compensating benefit to anyone, purely for the sake of achieving greater equality, regardless of how you cash out person-affecting. They might also endorse a wider understanding of the person-affecting principle that can account for the moral wrongness in non-identity cases, while still firmly rejecting the idea that leveling down is in any way morally desirable. Furthermore, that claims across outcomes framework we discussed earlier can be seen as aligning with a broader, more nuanced person-affecting perspective.
Okay, so it gets quite intricate there. Two other philosophers, Otsuka and Voorhoeve, have also raised some interesting objections to prioritarianism, particularly concerning its prudential implications for individuals and how it handles competing moral claims in situations with multiple people.
Yes, that's right. Their prudential justification objection primarily targets ex post prioritarianism, EPP, which
Yeah.
is one specific way of applying prioritarianism under uncertainty. They present scenarios like the example of Anandi considering a risky medical procedure with potential future impairment, where EPP might recommend an action that doesn't actually maximize the expected well-being of the individual concerned.
Uh-oh.
They argue, quite plausibly, that a good moral theory shouldn't dictate that an individual choose an option that is foreseeably worse for themselves in expectation, especially in these single-person decision scenarios.
Yeah, that does seem counterintuitive. Why would a moral principle tell someone to choose an option that they themselves expect will lead to a worse outcome for them? It seems to undermine the very idea of well-being that prioritarianism is supposedly based on.
Right. Prioritarian responses to this kind of objection often involve clarifying that perhaps EPP is best understood not as a guide for individual prudence, but as a principle for resolving conflicts between individuals and comparing social outcomes.
No, it's for social choice, not personal choice.
That's one line of defense. Some prioritarians propose hybrid ethical theories that give greater weight to individual expected well-being in single-person cases. Others might argue that even in individual choices, a broader ethical perspective that considers the moral value of well-being at different levels over time could still justify what appears to be a provincially suboptimal choice in a narrow short-term view. And importantly, other ways of applying prioritarianism to uncertainty, like ex ante prioritarianism, EAP, EDEP, and factualism, generally avoid this specific prudential objection.
Okay, so it might be specific to one version, EPP. And what about their competing claims objection? This sounds like it gets to the heart of how prioritarianism balances the needs of the worse off with potential benefits for others.
Yes, this objection, often illustrated by hypothetical scenarios involving individuals with different levels of well-being and different potential gains from some intervention, like the Bernard and Chimwala example in the source. It suggests that prioritarianism might not adequately respect the distinctness of persons and the real force of competing moral claims in multi-person situations. Even if a particular intervention offers a smaller increase in well-being to someone who is significantly worse off, prioritarians might still favor it over an intervention that would provide a much, much larger well-being gain to someone who is already somewhat better off.
Right.
The worry is that this might overlook the strength of the claim of the better off person to that potentially much larger benefit. It raises questions about how exactly we weigh the urgency of need against the magnitude of potential improvement and maybe the number of people affected.
So it's a question of how we balance the priority we give to the worse off with other morally relevant factors,
Right.
like the sheer size of the benefit and who's getting it.
Yeah. Prioritarian responses to this often reiterate the idea that prioritarianism provides a framework, a specific one, for resolving conflicts in the distribution of well-being, specifically in multi-person contexts where resources are limited or choices have to be made.
Okay.
They might argue that the worse-off individual's claim to even a smaller benefit has a greater moral urgency because of their lower baseline well-being. That's the core prioritarian move. The claims across outcomes framework, again, offers a way to articulate why the worse-off individual's claim might be considered stronger. The key here is that prioritarianism offers a specific way of weighing these competing claims based on individuals' levels of well-being, a way that differs from purely utilitarian aggregation or other egalitarian considerations that might focus more on the relational gap.
Okay, so egalitarian thinkers raise important questions about the intrinsic value of equality itself and how prioritarianism accounts for these relational aspects of well-being, while these other objections challenge its implications for individual choices and the balancing of competing needs. Now, let's turn our attention briefly to sufficientism. They also have a distinct perspective on how to prioritize the worse off, don't they? But it's different again.
Yes, definitely different. Sufficientism introduces the concept of a threshold of well-being. The core idea is that we have a particularly strong, maybe even absolute, moral obligation to bring everyone up to at least this sufficient level enough to have a decent life, however that's defined.
Okay, a line in the sand.
Right. Once everyone is above the threshold, sufficientists often argue that the moral imperative to further improve well-being diminishes significantly. Then maybe considerations of maximizing overall well-being, more like utilitarianism, might become more relevant, or maybe we just don't have strong obligations anymore.
So the priority is absolute or near absolute for those below this line of enough, and then things change dramatically once that threshold is met.
That's the general picture, yeah. This leads to two key differences between sufficientism and prioritarianism. First, That potential absolute priority given to those below the sufficiency threshold, regardless of the size of the benefit to those already above it. Second, above the threshold, sufficientism often implies a kind of utilitarian indifference to the distribution of well-being. A transfer from a richer person, above the threshold, to a less rich person, also above the threshold, might not be seen as morally important, or at least not nearly as important as getting someone to the threshold.
Uh-huh.
This means sufficientism can violate the Pigou-Dalton principle for transfers among those who are already considered sufficiently well off.
And the moral justification for this threshold idea often comes from the intuition that our compassion or moral concern for those in dire need has a particular urgency that just lessens, maybe, once a certain level of basic well-being is achieved.
Yeah, thinkers like Roger Christ have argued something along those lines that compassion motivates us to prioritize the needs of the poor, but this specific compassionate drive might not extend strongly to, say, redistributing resources among millionaires. The idea is that there's a kind of moral tipping point. Prioritarian responses to sufficientism often question whether this sharp threshold is ethically justifiable. They might argue, look, our moral concern for improving the lives of those who are worse off doesn't necessarily just cut off at some arbitrary level.
Right.
And they'd likely argue that the principle of Pigou-Dalton that transfers from better to worse off are generally a moral improvement should still hold, maybe to a lesser degree, but still hold even for those above some hypothetical sufficiency line. Why should helping someone go from pretty good to really good have zero moral value compared to helping someone go from bad to okay?
So prioritarians might argue that even improvements for those who are doing okay still have some moral value, especially if they are still significantly worse off than others in society, and that the idea of a strict enough point is hard to pin down and justify ethically. Okay, finally, we need to briefly touch on the complexities that arise when we consider applying prioritarianism to situations with variable populations where the number and even the identities of people in different possible futures might not be the same. This sounds like opening a huge can of worms.
Oh, it absolutely is. Yeah, this is an area that presents deep and challenging problems for virtually every ethical theory that concerns itself with overall outcomes, and prioritarianism is definitely no exception. One of the most famous philosophical puzzles in this area is Parfit's own repugnant conclusion.
The repugnant conclusion. That's the counterintuitive and, well, unsettling idea that a very large population of individuals with lives barely worth living where their level of well-being is just slightly above zero could, according to some versions of utilitarianism and even prioritarianism, be morally better than a much smaller population with lives of very high quality simply because the total amount of well-being, or in prioritarianism's case, the total sum of transformed well-being, is higher in the larger, much worse off population.
Exactly. That's it. Both total utilitarianism and prioritarianism, depending on the specific formulation of the prioritarian function, how concave it is, can potentially imply this. In fact, some have even pointed to a potential super repugnant conclusion where a larger population with slightly lower average well-being than a smaller but still very large and slightly better off population could be deemed morally superior by some prioritarian accounts due to the extreme concentration of well-being at very low levels getting massive weight.
Oof.
And there's also the negative repugnant conclusion, a similarly disturbing implication concerning populations with lives barely worth not living. These thought experiments really force us to confront fundamental questions about the value of individual lives versus the value of total well-being and the ethics of population size and quality. It gets very difficult very quickly.
These are definitely the kinds of thought experiments that push our moral intuitions to their breaking point. So how do prioritarians even begin to grapple with these deeply troubling conclusions?
Well, it's tough, and there's no single accepted answer. Some prioritarians suggest that maybe the principle of prioritarianism is best applied primarily within fixed population scenarios, and that different ethical considerations might need to come into play when we are comparing outcomes with different numbers of people. Maybe it's just not the right tool for that job.
Okay, limited scope.
Others explore modifications to the basic prioritarian framework specifically for variable populations. Things like average prioritarianism, which focuses on the average transformed well-being rather than the total sum, or prioritarian critical level theory, which introduces a threshold below which additional lives don't necessarily add positive moral value, or might even add negative value.
Trying to tweak them out to avoid the repugnance.
Essentially, yes. There are also more nuanced modal proposals that try to limit who counts when we are evaluating different possible worlds, maybe focusing only on people who exist in all the worlds being compared or something like that. It's a really active and highly debated area of philosophical research, trying to reconcile the core intuitions of prioritarianism with the undeniable complexities of population ethics.
Well, this has truly been a deep and fascinating dive into the intricacies of prioritarianism. We've explored its fundamental principles, its grounding in moral axioms like Pigou-Dalton and separability, the various arguments that support it, the significant challenges it faces from different ethical perspectives like utilitarianism and egalitarianism, and even these profound difficulties that arise when we consider uncertain futures and changing populations.
Yeah, and just to recap, I guess at its core, prioritarianism argues that when we're morally evaluating different outcomes, we should give greater moral weight to improvements in the well-being of those who are worse off. It formalizes this intuition through that strictly increasing and strictly concave transformation of individual well-being.
Mhm. And as we saw, it distinguishes itself from utilitarianism, egalitarianism, and sufficientism through its unique combination of satisfying the Pigou-Dalton separability and continuity axioms.
And as we've seen throughout our discussion, while prioritarianism offers a compelling and, for many, intuitively appealing framework for prioritizing the needs of the less fortunate, it also grapples with some really complex challenges, particularly when it comes to decision-making under uncertainty and these thorny ethical dilemmas posed by variable populations. These are clearly ongoing areas of philosophical inquiry and debate.
Absolutely. And this maybe leads to a crucial point for you, our listener, to ponder. Consider a time in your own life when you had to make a decision that would benefit someone who was struggling more significantly than it would benefit someone who was already doing relatively well.
Perhaps it was a decision about how to allocate your time or your money or even just your emotional energy. Did you intuitively feel that helping the person in greater need was the right thing to do, even if maybe the total overall benefit, narrowly measured, might have been slightly less? Does the core idea of prioritarianism, giving that extra weight, resonate with those kinds of moral intuitions that you've experienced?
It's definitely something to take away and reflect upon. How do these abstract principles actually map onto our lived moral experiences? We encourage you to delve further into this fascinating topic by exploring resources like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Entry on Prioritarianism, and the many related philosophical concepts we've touched on today. Understanding these different ethical frameworks can provide really valuable tools for thinking more deeply about the moral choices we face, both in our personal lives and, in the broader world. Thanks for joining us on this intellectual deep dive.